how to prepare for the next pandemic. Welcome to another True Health Tuesdays. And there has been some discussion about this in Europe about what to do if there was another pandemic. We don't know when that's going to be. They call it disease X because they don't really know when that could be. But they have a couple of possibilities looking at what's going on around the world, things like Ebola, Zika virus, etc. And what would we do in that kind of a situation? So I want to ask you, basically, what should we do to be prepared? And I think things will probably go down a little differently if we did have another pandemic. There was this article that was published in the Washington Post titled, "America Shut Down in Response to COVID. Would we ever do it again?" And the authors of this paper would say, no, actually, there's going to be a lot of resistance and tension if there's anything like a public health mandate to do it next time, which would definitely lead to an acceleration, of course, of that amplification of a potential contagious virus. We know that last time this happened, there were situations in certain states where there was actually rationing of healthcare, which means that there were so many people sick all at the same time that it just overwhelmed the healthcare industry and they could not actually take care of patients. And basically what happened was the state had to pass the protocols, specifically health crisis protocols, which basically states at that point that if you go to the hospital, you cannot expect to have the standard of care because there's simply just not enough healthcare employees, nurses, doctors, oxygen, medications to take care of everybody all at the same time. That makes sense. Well, you may not know this, but this actually happened in Idaho. And it came close to happening in a number of other states, including the one that I worked in, which was California. So one of the things that you've got to realize is that you may not be able to depend on infrastructure and healthcare infrastructure in the next pandemic. Here's a publication here. Idaho activates crisis standards of care in 3 healthcare districts in southern Idaho. And they simply go and talk about what happened here. This is the high number of both clinical and non-clinical staff unable to work due to the impacts of the virus. Infections coupled with a nationwide staffing shortage, limiting access to contracted traveling staff, is impacting current hospital operations. It's also limiting the availability of hospitals to maintain capacity for things like intensive care beds due to inadequate staffing. Additionally, nationwide shortages of blood and blood products is significantly impacting healthcare systems, and most have implemented blood conversion strategies or conservation strategies. So it's not just blood, it's not just staffing. We also see issues with medications because a lot of the medications that we use in the United States come from overseas and have to be shipped here. The other thing that we saw in the last pandemic here is the fact that we may have the technology, but if we don't have the staff to deliver that technology, then it's not going to be useful. This was an example here where we had dialysis machines, but no dialysis technologists or nurses to actually administer the technology to patients. So in my estimation, these are the issues that we're going to be dealing with in the next pandemic. Number one, lockdowns may not be as complete or as long because people have gone through that. They know what the downsides of lockdowns are in terms of businesses. And let's face it, people's appreciation for authority is not the same as it was in early 2020. And so because of all of this, surges may come earlier and perhaps spread more rapidly and more quickly. And as a result of that, there will be higher demand for healthcare products and services because people are going to get sick. And I'm actually going somewhere with this because we're going to have to realize that we're going to have to be able to have a plan B. So number 2, there's going to be possible hoarding and anticipated health products. This is for either personal use or resale. We all know about people that hoarded alcohol material. So for hand cleansers, for instance, even toilet paper, all of these things were hoarded so that they could be sold on the black market for very high prices. There'll be a shortage of supply of healthcare products, and the availability of drugs will be low. Let's say there is a drug that's off-label that could be used. Let's just say that that's a possibility. We don't know that that would work because it could be a different virus. If that were felt to be the case by the majority of people, obviously that medication would be bought out, sold out, hoarded, and would not be available for everybody in the United States. There wouldn't be any studies available on any specific drugs As I mentioned, though, however, if it was, it probably would not be available. And that's not only because of increased demand, but decreased supply, which is number 3 here. Supply chain may be disrupted both domestically and internationally. Many people that we rely on to transport this material will be either ill, contagious, or dead. Items that require a supply chain may not be available. What may be available will increase in value because it'll be in high demand. So medications like insulin, blood thinners, these are not going to be available, so people are going to need these. They may get complications from not getting these, and this may exacerbate healthcare systems. If vaccines are developed, let's just say per chance that they're able to develop somehow a vaccine or have a vaccine prior for some sort of virus, it's going to be very difficult to distribute because there's just not going to be that infrastructure to deliver it. And there would be limited of any testing at that point. So this is going to be a very interesting time. And also, many healthcare personnel may not be available, again, because either they're ill, contagious, or dead, especially since the ones taking care of these patients are going to be at ground zero taking care of them and at highest risk for actually getting infected. And again, this could lead to additional crisis protocols being put into place like they were already in Idaho. And if things get really out of hand and spiral out of control, you could have an impact on law enforcement, which could lead to looting and revocation of personal freedoms, things of that nature. So remember that all of these things are delicately interlinked. And when things start to go down, people start to act in ways that are just not predictable, or maybe perhaps are predictable. So as a result of that, ideally, we would want to have access to standard of care medicine. So not saying anything against standard of care medicine. I am an intensive care physician. I treat patients every day with medications that are life-saving. When people get into critical situations, the need of antibiotics, vasopressors, insulin, all of these are things that prevent the chain of life from breaking. Obviously, good healthcare, but even more than that, lifestyle is going to make those links in the chain stronger and better able to withstand that. But let's remember that all sorts of things can happen even in people who have great lifestyles. People can get into car accidents. People can have intracerebral bleeds. And these are things that need advanced healthcare. And if you don't have it, then you get bad outcomes. So ideally, we would like to have access to all of those standards of care, good medicine, but realize that not all these things are going to be available, especially in crisis situations. So that if you're dealing with a pandemic, you're going to want to make sure that you have a plan B. And ideally, a plan B would be something that's not dependent on a supply chain, not dependent on a diagnosis or a test, not dependent on a pharmacist dispensing it, not being able to be hoarded, and it should be widely available and inexpensive, perhaps even free, and effective against a number of infectious agents. So let's talk about 2 of those today. One of them is going to be sunlight. And as you can see here, sunlight, as we go through the number of years up to the pandemic, notice that influenza is something that is very common when the sun is the lowest in the sky. In fact, a number of studies have shown that sunlight is very good at preventing a lot of these illnesses. In fact, if you look at the illnesses that we keep track of, things like heart disease, COVID-19, stroke, lower respiratory diseases, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, influenza, pneumonia, kidney disease, you can see that they all seem to fluctuate with the seasons. It may not be, humidity and temperature, although some people might make that argument, but I believe it's related to the amount of sunlight that we are actually getting. And to that degree, there has been a number of studies that have looked at this. One study looked at this in Europe to see when the COVID-19 surges started in the autumn of 2020. And what they found is when they looked at the different countries in Europe, they found that temperature in these countries made absolutely no prediction as to when those countries were going to have their surge. The humidity, again, had no predictive power in determining when those surges started in the autumn of 2020. But when you look at latitude, so with Finland at the very top of the globe and Greece at the bottom of Europe, you can see there was a very strong correlation in terms of latitude, indicating that it was sunlight particularly that was keeping people out of the surges of COVID-19. Another study looked at this in the United States, in Great Britain, and in Italy. And they looked at mortality scores dependent on the latitude. And of course, a lot of you might think, well, vitamin D, yeah, that's something that you get from the sun, and that might be involved with this. Well, here they looked at areas that were not getting enough vitamin D in the winter that couldn't, because ultraviolet B radiation, which is the type of radiation that stimulates vitamin D production in the skin, was not able to come through at that angle. However, ultraviolet A and, of course, infrared light could do that. And what they found very significantly is when they eliminated the portions of the United States that could make enough vitamin D in the winter, and they just looked at the portion of the United States that couldn't, they noticed a very specific relationship that as the amount of ultraviolet radiation went up, that's ultraviolet A radiation, not the type of radiation that makes vitamin D, they noticed that mortality from COVID-19 went down. They noticed exactly the same relationship in England and the same relationship in Italy. And they came to a very specific conclusion as a result of this. They said if this is a causal relationship, it suggests that optimizing sun exposure may be a possible public health intervention. Given that the effect appears independent of a vitamin D pathway, it suggests possible new COVID-19 therapies. Well, this was very interesting, of course, and I teamed up with another scholar by the name of Margaret Skutch, who is a geographist from the University of Mexico. And we looked at the same thing, and we found in a global situation that countries that were higher in latitude than countries that were closer to the equator had worse mortality, had higher mortality than those that were not. And so this is also something that we've been finding as well. So the question might be, why would that be the case? Why would it be that sunlight might be helpful not only for influenza, but for COVID-19 and perhaps a myriad of other viruses? Well, it has to do with what's going on in the cell. In the cell, there is a pro-oxidant called AT2 or angiotensin 2, which gets converted to angiotensin 1,7, which is an antioxidant. That's a good conversion because you want antioxidants and you want to get rid of pro-oxidants. Well, as it turns out, that is mitigated by an enzyme called ACE2. ACE2, of course, is the enzyme that the SARS-CoV-2 virus binds to and inhibits. So the pro-oxidant angiotensin 2 actually is ROS, or reactive oxygen species. We don't like reactive oxygen species in cells normally, and as a result of that, the ACE2 does something very good in making angiotensin 1,7, because angiotensin 1,7 actually blocks reactive oxygen species, which is good. So as you can see here very clearly from this graph, ACE2 is something that you want to have. Unfortunately, the virus hits it, it inhibits it, and it also stimulates white blood cells to make more reactive oxygen species. So what we do is we want to reduce the amount of oxygen species because they can make blood clots, and those blood clots clog up the pulmonary arteries and they can cause hypoxemia. So one way of mitigating reactive oxygen species is to make sure you're getting enough sleep at night. So going to bed early, getting enough melatonin from the pineal gland is going to minimize reactive oxygen species. But a new study, one that was published in Melatonin Research by Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder, has shown that, in fact, melatonin can be made on-site in the mitochondria by simple exposure to the sun, which gives quite amount of near-infrared radiation or near-infrared light. And that will be very, very helpful. We can see this in terms of proof by looking at something called plasma F2 isoprostane. And as you can see in COVID patients, they're always higher regardless of the age group, meaning that COVID does oxidative damage on cells. So this is something that we really want to avoid if possible. So there was a publication that was published last year, actually in 2022, in one of the top photochemistry and photobiology journals called the Journal of Photochemistry and Photobiology. And what they did was basically a randomized placebo-controlled trial where they made them wear this LED vest, these COVID patients that had come into the hospital. And these LED bulbs were not giving off light that you could see, but rather light that you couldn't see in the near-infrared field. And this actually showed a dramatic improvement in COVID-19 outcomes. In fact, these patients were discharged from the hospital 4 days earlier when they were given just 15 minutes a day of this type of near-infrared radiation. What's really interesting as well is that you can get a huge amount of near-infrared radiation just by going outside in the sun, but particularly if you're in the sun around trees with green leaves, because as you can see here, the infrared radiation part of the spectrum is amplified going from here to here if you're outside in green spaces. And so going outside in green spaces is tremendously beneficial in terms of the amount of near-infrared light. So going outside into green spaces, into trees, grass, leaves is very beneficial. Now, this is something that we've known for a long period of time. And you can see here, these are pictures of hospitals around the world that utilized in their patient treatment protocols well before the 1920s getting out into the sun, because they noticed that these young people, patients, you can see here that they've got them all sort of lined up here. This particular one here is in Colorado, I believe, is in Denver, where these patients are outside getting plenty of sunlight. Now, if you think that this is kind of fringe, or maybe people don't understand this, well, here is the Harvard Kennedy School of Business. And they know that there's a huge impact of economic problems when you have influenza and a pandemic. And so these two professors at Harvard came up with this publication looking at exactly this. And they found that sunlight was protective against influenza. In fact, in their abstract, they wrote this very strongly worded statement: we find that sunlight strongly protects against getting influenza. And this relationship was driven almost entirely by the severe H1N1 pandemic in the fall of 2009. So just a recent pandemic that we've seen. So we've seen here, just looking at sunlight, that it does fit all of our criteria. It's not dependent on a supply chain. It's not dependent on a diagnosis or a test. It's not dependent on a pharmacist dispensing it. It's not able to be hoarded. You can't hoard sunlight. It's widely available and inexpensive, and it's effective against a number of infectious agents, as we've seen. Of course, sometimes the clouds come in and you can't get it all, but eventually, if you wait long enough, there will be enough sunlight. So I do think that that is beneficial. Okay, let's talk about another type of therapy, which is hydrotherapy. And this encourages an innate immune response. There's two types to your immune system. There is the innate immune system, and there is the adaptive immune system. And unfortunately, the innate immune system gets weaker with age, and it may be the reason why people who are older in age had worse COVID. But as you can see here, there are certain aspects of this innate immune system, like the macrophage, the monocyte, and the natural killer cells, which are very adept at killing things that you've never seen before from an immunological standpoint. The major player in that is something called interferon. Interferon is a substance that your body makes that has a very broad coverage against many different types of invaders, including viruses. Now, there was a paper that was published way back in 2020, 4 years ago, that suggested, based on evidence, that SARS-CoV-2, just like its ancestor SARS and MERS, suppresses the body's ability to make interferon. It suppresses the innate immune system. And we could see that here further on. This was published in Science, and it showed very specifically that related to the amount of interferon that was secreted in the body, if there was a large amount, there was a mild amount or mild reaction to COVID-19. If very little was made, that was critical. So as you can see here, the more interferon your body can make, the better you are able to weather the storm of COVID-19. And this went on, and you can see here that they actually delved into SARS-CoV-2 and actually found the specific gene that does this. It's called MAC1, and they found that MAC1, which is a gene in SARS-CoV-2, was required for your body to suppress interferon. So in other words, when this gene was activated, which it always was in SARS-CoV-2, it was able to suppress your body's ability to make interferon and therefore gain a foothold into your system and wreak havoc. Well, when scientists took this gene and made mutations in it, basically made it ineffective, and then infected the body with SARS-CoV-2, you can see here, going from blue, which was the wild type where MAC1 is intact, to the yellow where MAC1 was damaged. You can see here that SARS-CoV-2 was no match for the body's interferon levels. You can see that interferon levels were much higher with the mutated SARS-CoV-2 version, and that in all of these cases, the body was able to mount an immune response. What does this mean? This means that MAC1, or the virus, the gene MAC1 on the virus SARS-CoV-2, is imperative if SARS-CoV-2 wants to get a foothold. And the reason why that is because it suppresses interferon secretion in the body. So understanding that and realizing, of course, that you can't simply inactivate MAC1, what you need to do is you need to come up with ways that are able to work around MAC1 and stimulate interferon levels regardless. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about here. So we found in many studies going back that interferon in chronic viral infections actually was able to basically reduce a chronic infection and even cure them. These were a bunch of COVID patients that were given interferon just subcutaneously. And what we found is that it reduced the hospitalization rates in these patients by 50%. So what can we do? Is there a natural way of increasing interferon levels? Well, actually, as it turns out, the answer is yes. And this was published many years ago in this study that was titled Hyperthermia in Humans Enhances Interferon Gamma Synthesis and Alters the Peripheral Lymphocyte Population. Guess what? When you heated up the body to around 39 degrees Celsius or 102 degrees Fahrenheit, there was a 10-fold increase in the amount of interferon that was secreted. So not only not giving Tylenol or paracetamol to patients with fevers to make sure that their fevers are adequate, unless, of course, they go over 103 or 104 or they have a rapid heart rate or seizures. You don't want that. But so long as they're having a healthy fever during an infection, this is actually beneficial because interferon is the way that the body gets rid of those viral particles. And as you can see, this was also practiced many years ago. You can see this is a photograph from the Battle Creek Sanitarium, patient in a world bath. This is around 1910, well before the discovery of penicillin. This is how we used to stimulate the body's innate immune system to make interferon. There's another picture here of light, going back to our first picture there, basically. But you can see it's very labor intensive. It requires human labor to get these people's temperatures up high enough. There was an article back in 1919 during the epidemic of influenza written by a physician by the name of Wells A. Rubel, who went on to be the first president of what is now known as Loma Linda University. And he said that the present epidemic of influenza has furnished an excellent opportunity to test out the efficacy of rational treatment in dealing with respiratory disorders, especially in conditions accompanying and following attacks of influenza. And he compared what was going on in the Army hospitals at the time that was using a lot of aspirin, which actually brings fevers down, compared to what they were doing in the Northeast in about 10 sanitariums. And you can see here that when early on that fevers were encouraged rather than being suppressed, there was 1/8 the incidence of pneumonia. And of course, pneumonia at the time was a killer because this was before antibiotics. And once you had pneumonia, there wasn't much that you can do. Overall, however, you can see that the use of hydrotherapy to increase body temperature reduced the infection fatality rate by almost 1/6. There's also other stories where an entire seminary in Hutchinson, Minnesota was affected, and not a single student was lost because they quickly employed the use of hydrotherapy, among other things that we'll talk about. So this was not done in a vacuum. There was actually some research at the time back in 1917 by a gentleman by the name of Wagner Joreg, who was an Austrian psychiatrist, who noticed that in his insane asylum patients, that those that had neurosyphilis actually improved their symptoms when they had fever. So as you can see here in this picture, Dr. Wagner Joreg, who's the gentleman there in the back with his hand on the shoulder of the patient, as this patient is being injected with malaria-infected blood from another patient with a similar blood type to induce malaria in that patient. Now that patient would have high fevers, and those high fevers would then stimulate the innate immune system to kill the infection that was chronically going on in this patient. Well, for his work, Dr. Wagner Joreg won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927, and that was work from a decade earlier in 1917. Well, interestingly, the very next year, in 1928, we had the discovery of penicillin. And for that, Fleming won the Nobel Prize in 1945. Now, it's interesting to note that it's much easier to purify a substance like penicillin and to give it out to patients, and much less work intensive, but also very effective. So the problem, however, though, is during a pandemic, which is what we're talking about, it might be very difficult to process, purify, and manufacture enough of a drug that would take care of a patient in a pandemic just because of the simple numbers. So instead of going back to nothing and just going home and waiting to be admitted because you're hypoxic, let's go back to the step right before that, which would include hydrotherapy. So hydrotherapy, again, is not dependent on a supply chain. It's not dependent on a diagnosis or a test. It wouldn't be dependent on a pharmacist dispensing it. It would not be able to be hoarded. It's widely available and inexpensive, perhaps even free. All you need is some water and some towels. And it's effective against a number of infectious agents that we just talked about, and that's because it works to increase interferon, which is the body's own system that is used and utilized to attack a number of different diseases. All right, so we talked about sunshine and hydrotherapy. All of this in addition to other types of care like nutrition. By the way, there are some studies that show that plant-based diets improve and increase interferon secretion, and that the innate immune system is amplified by a plant-based diet, so being vegan basically. They also note, by the way, that a low-carb ketogenic diet, which would occur if you don't eat that third meal of the day and instead intermittently fast, that increases the adaptive immune system, which uses antibodies to specific antigens. But also realize that exercise, getting plenty of sleep, as we talked about, and fresh air, which contains phytocides from trees, can also help and improve your longevity during a pandemic, because all of these things are not dependent on a supply chain, not dependent on a diagnosis or test, not dependent on pharmacists dispensing it, not able to be hoarded, widely available and inexpensive, and effective against a number of infectious agents. So I would like to say here, and just stop, that again, let me be very clear. I'm not saying that these things should be done instead of standard of care, but rather in addition to and as a plan B. There's no harm in implementing these things anyway. Of course, if things go awry and medications are needed in extreme situations, they may be always there. But remember, and this is the key point here, this is the underlying basis of this entire thing, is that if more and more people were to institute what we're talking about here, there would be less and less people that would be dependent and require the systems that are set up in the healthcare. And so they may be used for people that actually would need them, and where these things perhaps would not be able to treat 100%. Let's not forget that there was still a case fatality rate even with hydrotherapy, although it was 1/6 of that. And can you imagine if we had a situation where only 1/6 of the people needing healthcare products needed it instead of all of them? We would actually have enough, and we'd be able to treat more and more people. So I hope this has been important. I hope this has been helpful to you. And I think you should look at more of these things as we look to the future in terms of making ourselves more healthy and more resilient to these things that come in our environment. Thanks for joining us again for True Health Tuesdays.